On the night of his 36th birthday, the most feared Mafia boss in Savannah walked into the city's finest restaurant seeking nothing but silence and a piece of steak. But he couldn't get a single table until a struggling single mother, hiding from her violent past with her 5-year-old daughter, invited him to sit down with them. And what happened next didn't just change his life. It shattered everything he thought he knew about power, family, and redemption. If you love stories about dangerous men finding their hearts and broken women finding their strength, hit that like button right now. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. Ready to see how a devil learns to love? Anthony Caruso pulled out the chair and sat down, his movements slow, as though he were stepping into a negotiation whose rules he hadn't quite learned yet. The table was far smaller than anything he was used to, with no safe distance, no bodyguard stationed behind him, only a brown-haired woman with tired green eyes and a 5-year-old child staring at him as if she had just discovered a strange new animal at the zoo. He placed his hands on the tabletop and realized he didn't know what to do with them. In meetings with other bosses, his hands always knew their place, resting on the table to project openness, folding across his chest to signal power, or hidden beneath the surface when he might need to reach for a gun. But here, amid soft music and the warm scent of food, his hands were just hands, and that unsettled him more than any confrontation ever had. "You're really tall," the child said first, her voice clear and carrying no intention of lowering its volume at all. "Are you a giant?" Anthony blinked. He had faced assassins who didn't hesitate when they pulled a trigger, had stared down men who wanted him dead without flinching, yet this 5-year-old's question cost him a full second to process. "No," he answered, his voice deeper than usual because he wasn't used to talking to children. "I'm just tall, Chloe," the mother murmured gently, a flicker of embarrassment crossing her face along with something that looked suspiciously like suppressed laughter. "We don't ask strangers things like that." "But you said I should ask if I want to know." Chloe shot back at once, her logic firm and impossible to argue with. "And I want to know." "He's taller than the guard at the supermarket. The guard at the supermarket is 1.80 meters. "I know because I asked him already." Anthony glanced at the woman. Sarah, the name she had given when she invited him to sit. She was looking at her daughter with the expression of someone long accustomed to being placed in awkward situations by a child's unfiltered honesty. "I'm sorry," she said to Anthony, her voice tired but not truly apologetic. "She asks a lot of questions. A lot. About everything." "It's fine," Anthony replied, and he surprised himself by realizing he meant it. No one had asked him such simple questions in a very long time. The questions he usually received were about territory, about money, about who would live and who would die. "What do you do for work?" Chloe went on, entirely undeterred by her mother's warning look. "You dress nice. Mom says people who dress nice usually have a lot of money. Do you have a lot of money, Chloe?" Sarah raised her voice just a little, her cheeks flushing, and Anthony realized it had been years since he'd seen anyone blush from embarrassment in front of him, rather than from fear. "I'm in business," he answered, choosing the safest reply he could think of. "What kind of business?" "Lots of kinds." "How many kinds is lots?" 2 kinds, 10 kinds, 100 kinds. Sarah lifted a hand to cover her face, clearly counting to 10 in her head. Anthony, against every survival instinct he possessed, felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Not quite a smile. He couldn't remember how to do that anymore, but something close to it. "About 30 kinds, he said, not entirely sure why he was answering instead of falling silent the way he normally would. 30 kinds is a lot," Chloe nodded solemnly, as though she had just received vital information and was filing it away in her memory. "My mom only does 2 things. She's very tired. If you do 30 things, are you tired too?" Anthony looked into the child's clear eyes, then at the mother who seemed to be trying to sink into her chair. He thought about the past 18 years, about sleepless nights, about blood on his hands, about decisions that couldn't be taken back, about the vast, empty mansion he returned to every night. "Yes," he said, his voice lower, more honest. "I'm very tired." Chloe tilted her head, studying him with an expression older than her years. "Then you should sleep more," she advised seriously. "My mom says when I'm tired I have to sleep." "Don't you sleep." Sarah looked up, her eyes meeting Anthony's for a brief moment, and in them he saw a strange, quiet understanding, as though she knew what it meant to be bone-tired, as though she understood that there were kinds of exhaustion sleep couldn't cure. The server appeared with menus, breaking the moment, and Anthony had never been so grateful for a server in his life. The server stood beside the table with a small notepad and a practiced smile, asking whether they were ready to order. Sarah looked down at the menu, and Anthony noticed that she read the prices before she read the names of the dishes, her eyes sliding quickly along the right column before drifting back to the left. It was the habit of someone used to counting every dollar, and Anthony recognized it because he had once lived that way himself. Years ago, when his father was still alive and the Caruso name had not yet become something that made people tremble, she ordered the cheapest salad on the menu for herself. But when Chloe pointed at the spaghetti with tomato sauce, she nodded immediately without glancing at the price. Anthony ordered the steak he had wanted from the start, and when the server asked about drinks, he said water. Sarah lifted an eyebrow at him. "It's your birthday and you're only drinking water," she asked, her tone lightly teasing in a way he hadn't expected from someone he had just met. "I drove here," Anthony replied. "Sensible, but still sad," Sarah said, and Chloe nodded in agreement as if she fully understood the conversation between adults. "Mom says, drinking water on your birthday is sad too," Chloe added. "But Mom always drinks water," Sarah explained gently, a flicker crossing her eyes that Anthony couldn't quite read. "And because water is cheaper than the other things." Chloe shrugged, accepting that answer, and turned back to the box of colored pencils the restaurant had placed on the table for children, leaving the two adults in a silence that was not entirely comfortable but not tense either. Anthony realized he didn't know what to say. In his world, every conversation had a purpose, either to negotiate, to threaten, or to extract information. But here, with this woman, he had no purpose at all, and that made him feel as though he were standing in a place with no map. "You just moved to Savannah?" he asked, choosing a neutral question. Sarah nodded. 6 months ago, from Atlanta. "Work." "Partly." She paused, as though weighing how much to reveal. "I needed a change of scenery. A fresh start." Anthony understood fresh starts, and he also understood that people did not leave everything behind to move to a new city without a reason big enough to push them. But he didn't press. He knew the value of privacy. "What do you do here?" he asked instead. Sarah gave a soft laugh with a bitter edge at the corners. "Whatever I can. During the day I work as a cashier at Morrison's grocery store on Bull Street, 3 shifts a week. Thursday through Sunday nights I wait tables at Riley's bar across the river." She said it the way someone read a shopping list, without complaint or a plea for sympathy, just the plain facts of her life. Anthony had met plenty of wealthy people who complained about trivial inconveniences, but this woman held 2 jobs to raise her child and spoke of it as casually as if she were talking about the weather. "So who watches Chloe when you're working?" he asked. "Mrs. Thompson in the apartment next door. She's 72 and watches television all day, but she loves Chloe and doesn't charge much." Chloe stopped coloring and looked up. "Mrs. Thompson lets me watch the movie about people singing on mountains," she said. "There are lots of people singing. They wear curtains. The sound of music," Sarah translated, her lips curving faintly. "Chloe has watched that one about 20 times already." The server brought the drinks, and as he passed behind Sarah to set down the glass of water, her body stiffened for a brief instant. Her shoulders lifted, her hand tightened on the edge of the table, and her eyes flicked backward before her mind could catch up with the fact that it was only the server. The reaction lasted less than a second, and if Anthony had not spent his entire life watching others in order to survive, he would not have noticed. But he did. He noticed the way she always chose a seat that faced the door. He noticed how she glanced up every time someone entered the restaurant. He noticed how her grip on her daughter's hand tightened just a little when a tall man walked past their table. Sarah Mitchell was hiding from someone. Anthony didn't know who, but he knew fear when he saw it. He had caused that fear in many people over the course of his life, and he knew how it left its mark, how it carved reflexes into a person's body that they could not control. The food arrived, and Anthony watched Sarah cut her salad into small pieces in a mechanical rhythm, while her eyes continued to sweep the restaurant at steady intervals. Chloe, completely oblivious, twirled spaghetti around her fork and told Anthony about the unicorn she wanted to have if unicorns were real, and if they had a bigger house, and if Mom wasn't allergic to fur, although Chloe wasn't entirely sure whether unicorns even had fur. Anthony listened, or at least pretended to, while his mind worked. He didn't know why he cared. This woman meant nothing to him. This child meant nothing to him. He could finish his meal, thank them for letting him sit with them, and walk away without ever looking back. That was what he should do. That was the safest thing to do. But when Sarah laughed at something Chloe said, a real laugh that lit up her exhausted face, Anthony realized he didn't want this dinner to end, and that, more than anything else that night, frightened him. Dinner ended the way dinners usually did, with empty plates and conversation thinning into quiet stretches. Chloe had fallen asleep on her mother's shoulder 15 minutes earlier, her small hand still clutching a purple-colored pencil she had used to draw a unicorn on the restaurant's paper placemat. Anthony watched the sleeping child and felt something strange stir in his chest, a sensation he had no name for because he hadn't felt it in a very long time. When the check arrived, he reached for it before Sarah could react. "Let me," he said, his tone not quite an offer and almost a command. Sarah shook her head immediately. "No, we pay our share." She said it with a firmness Anthony recognized at once, the firmness of someone who had taken too much from other people in the past and learned that nothing was ever free. "All right," he said, and he noticed her shoulders loosen just slightly when he didn't argue. They split the bill, and Anthony watched Sarah carefully count each bill from a wallet worn thin at the corners. She left a tip that was polite and precise, not a cent more, and he knew it was because she didn't have a cent to spare. When she wasn't looking, he left 3 times the usual amount, folding the cash and slipping it beneath a plate. They stepped outside, and the Savannah night greeted them with damp cold drifting in from the river. Sarah carried Chloe in her arms, the child's small body curled against her like a kitten. Anthony walked beside them toward the parking lot, not knowing why he was still there, not knowing why he didn't simply say goodbye and drive his Maserati back to the empty mansion, waiting for him. "Thank you," Sarah said when they reached her car, an older Honda Civic with a dent in the right door and silver paint flaking in several places, for not making tonight any stranger than it already was. Anthony nodded. "Thank you for letting me sit with you." Sarah opened the back door and eased Chloe into the child seat with movements so practiced it was clear she had done this thousands of times before. She closed the door gently so she wouldn't wake her daughter, then walked around to the driver's side. Anthony knew he should leave. He stayed where he was. Sarah turned the key. The engine sputtered once, twice, then went silent. She tried again, the same result, a third time, a fourth. And Anthony could see her shoulders tightening, could see the way her hands clenched the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. She didn't curse, didn't slam her palm against the dashboard, didn't cry. She just sat there in silence, head bowed slightly, as though this were only one more in a long list of things that had gone wrong in her life, and she no longer had the energy to react. Anthony tapped lightly on her window. Sarah looked up, and in that moment he saw everything she was trying to hide. The exhaustion, the frustration, the vague fear of having to walk home through the night with a 5-year-old child. She opened the door. "The battery," she said flatly. "I knew it was about to die. I was just hoping it would last one more week." Anthony didn't say he would call a mechanic because it was nearly 11 at night and no mechanic was coming. He didn't say he would drive her home because he knew she would refuse. Instead, he said, "My car's over there. I'm headed west. Which way are you going?" It was a lie. He didn't know which direction she lived in, and whichever one she named, he would have said he was going that way too. Sarah looked at him, and he could see the battle playing out in her mind. Pride told her to refuse, to call a taxi, to handle it herself the way she always had. But Chloe was asleep in the back seat, and the night was cold, and a taxi would cost money she didn't have. "I don't need," she started. "I know you don't need to." Anthony cut in, his voice free of the pity he sensed she hated. "But the kid's asleep and it's cold. You can hate me afterward." Sarah glanced at the back seat, where Chloe slept peacefully, unaware of the world and its troubles. When she looked back at Anthony, the resistance in her eyes had faded. "Oakwood Apartments," she said, her voice low, as if she were embarrassed to speak the address aloud, on Water Street. Anthony knew the area. It was one of the roughest parts of the city, a place even his own men avoided at night unless they had to go there. He gave nothing away in his expression. "I know it," he said, and headed for his car. Anthony's black Maserati was parked a few spaces away, gleaming beneath the streetlights like a resting predator. As he opened the door, he heard Chloe's small, sleepy sigh as Sarah lifted her from the old Honda. He waited while Sarah settled her into the back seat of the Maserati, watched her fumble with the seatbelt for a few seconds before figuring out how the unfamiliar mechanism worked. "Whoa," Chloe murmured in her half-sleep, her eyes fluttering open when she touched the soft leather. "This car is so comfy, Mom. Go back to sleep, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, pressing a kiss to her daughter's forehead. Chloe drifted off again at once, and Sarah closed the door carefully before sliding into the front seat. The drive passed in near silence. Anthony guided the car through Savannah's familiar streets. from the warm glow of the restaurant district, past the downtown blocks with their shuttered storefronts, then gradually into narrower, darker roads where streetlights were sparse and many bulbs had burned out and never been replaced. When they reached Oakwood Apartments, Anthony had to work to keep his reaction off his face. The building looked as though it had surrendered decades ago, with concrete walls blotched by damp stains, rusted outdoor staircases, and a parking lot riddled with potholes where battered old cars crowded together. A group of young men lingered near the corner, watching the Maserati with expressions that mixed curiosity and hostility. "This is it," Sarah said, her tone edged with something defiant, as though she were waiting for him to comment. Anthony didn't comment. He looked at the building, then at the woman beside him, and somewhere in his mind, a decision had already been made that he didn't fully understand. Sarah opened the car door and stepped out, the chill of the Savannah night clinging to her skin at once. She opened the back door to lift Chloe, and the child automatically looped her arms around her mother's neck without waking, a reflex shaped by countless nights like this. Anthony stepped out as well, and she heard his footsteps on the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. She turned, intending to say thank you and goodbye, intending to end this strange evening and return to her normal life, if her life could even be called normal. But Anthony was standing there, closer than she had expected, and in the weak light from the single working street lamp his face looked carved from stone and shadow. "Thank you," she said, her voice smaller than she meant it to be. "For everything. You didn't have to do this." Anthony didn't answer right away. He slipped a hand into his suit pocket, and for a brief instant Sarah's survival instincts made her step back half a pace, her body shielding Chloe automatically, but when his hand emerged it held only a small black card. He extended it toward her without speaking. Sarah looked down. The card was strangely simple. Nothing but a string of 10 digits printed in silver ink against deep black. No name, no title, no address, no other information at all. "If you need anything," he said, his voice low and even, as though he were commenting on the weather instead of giving his number to a woman he had met only hours earlier. Sarah stared at the card and then at him. She didn't understand. She didn't understand why a man who drove a Maserati and wore tailored suits would care whether a single mother in a rundown complex needed anything. She didn't understand why he hadn't asked for her number instead of offering his, as though he were handing her control instead of taking it. She didn't understand why he was looking at her that way, not with pity or with the hunger she was used to seeing in men, but with something close to respect. "Why?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop herself. Anthony was silent for a long moment, long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer at all. And then he said, his voice carrying something she couldn't quite decipher, "Because you don't know who I am." Sarah didn't understand what that meant. She wanted to ask more, wanted to know who this mysterious man was, and why he was acting as though she mattered to him. But Chloe shifted in her arms, and the moment passed. She looked down at the card again. Every survival instinct that had kept her alive all these years told her not to take it, not to accept anything from strange men, not to create a thread of connection with someone she didn't know, not to let herself owe anyone anything. But another part of her, the part that was tired of facing everything alone, the part that had forgotten what it felt like to have someone offer help without demanding something in return. That part reached out and took the card. She slipped it into her coat pocket without looking at it again, as though if she didn't look, it wouldn't really exist. "Good night," she said, and turned toward the rusted staircase leading up to her apartment. She didn't look back. She didn't need to look back to know he was still standing there, watching until she unlocked her door and disappeared inside. Only after she had laid Chloe on the bed and locked the 3 bolts on the door did she take the card out and study it for a long time in the dim glow of her daughter's night lamp. 10 digits and nothing else, and she didn't know why she hadn't thrown it away. She only knew that she hadn't. A week passed, and Anthony Caruso found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He was waiting. His phone lay on the oak desk in his private office at the Caruso estate, and he realized he had looked at it far more often than necessary. She didn't call. No message. Not a single sign that she remembered that night or the card he had given her. Anthony wasn't surprised. He hadn't expected her to call, and yet he couldn't explain why the absence of it unsettled him so deeply. He had tried not to think about her tired green eyes, about the way she flinched when someone walked behind her, about the rundown apartment where she was raising her child alone. He had tried to focus on work, on numbers and deals, and the problems that needed solving across his empire. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Chloe's smile when she asked whether he was a giant, and that made him angry with himself. On the 7th day, Anthony summoned Frank DeLuca to his office. Frank had been his right hand for 15 years. A 45-year-old man with salt and pepper hair and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. Frank stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and waited. He didn't ask what Anthony wanted, because he knew the boss would speak when the boss was ready. "I need you to look into someone," Anthony said, his tone calm as though this were nothing more than a routine business request. "Sarah Mitchell. Lives at Oakwood Apartments on Water Street. Has a daughter about 5 years old named Chloe." Frank didn't ask why. He simply nodded and said, "What do you need to know?" "Everything." Anthony paused for a second, then added, and quietly, "I don't want her to know." Frank studied his boss for a long moment, long enough for Anthony to know the man was wondering, and wise enough not to ask. "Understood," Frank said, and left. 3 days later, Frank returned with a thin folder. He set it on Anthony's desk and took the chair opposite him, his face blank but tension visible in the way he held himself. Anthony opened the folder and began to read. Sarah Mitchell, 27 years old, born in Columbus, Georgia. Mother died of cancer when she was 12. Father left when she was 15. Raised by her grandmother until the woman passed away when Sarah was 19. Married Ryan Mitchell at age 20 in Atlanta. Chloe Mitchell born 1 year later. And then everything began to unravel. Anthony kept reading, and with every line his jaw tightened. Report from Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta 3 years ago. Fractured ribs, facial trauma, patient claimed she fell down the stairs. Second report 2 years ago, scalp laceration, bruising on arms and neck, patient claimed a household accident. Third report 18 months ago, broken wrist, cut on upper lip, patient claimed she slipped in the bathroom. Anthony had seen every kind of violence in his life. He had ordered things most people could never imagine. But this was a different kind of violence, the kind that happened within the four walls of a home where people were supposed to be safe, the kind victims lied about because they were too frightened or too ashamed to tell the truth. He read on. Emergency protective order filed 14 months ago in Fulton County Court in Atlanta. Plaintiff Sarah Mitchell. Defendant Ryan Mitchell. Grounds prolonged domestic abuse. Threats to kill wife and daughter. Illegal possession of weapons. Order granted. Ryan Mitchell prohibited from approaching Sarah and Chloe Mitchell within 300 meters. The next page was Ryan Mitchell's file, and Anthony read it with the eyes of a man who had assessed hundreds of enemies in his lifetime. 32 years old. Prior conviction for domestic violence. Released after 9 months due to prison overcrowding. Drug-related offense. Suspended sentence. Currently wanted for violating the restraining order. Last sighting in Macon about 2.5 hours from Savannah 4 months ago. The attached photograph showed a man with sunken eyes, sharp cheekbones, and the hollow stare of someone whose insides had been eaten away by drugs. Anthony studied the image for a long time, memorizing every line of the man's face. "Anything else?" he asked, his voice frighteningly even. Frank nodded slowly. She moved to Savannah 6 months ago under a new address. Didn't register mail forwarding from the old place. No social media. New phone with a new number. She tried to disappear. Anthony closed the folder. "She's hiding," he said. Not as a question, but as a statement. "She's hiding from him." Frank nodded. "And he's looking for her. Men like him always are." The room sank into silence. Anthony stared out the window, where the Savannah afternoon sun stretched across the perfectly trimmed lawns of his estate. He thought about Sarah, about the way she positioned herself facing the door, about how she startled at footsteps behind her, about how she lived in that crumbling complex and worked 2 jobs to raise her child without complaint. She had crossed state lines to protect her daughter. She had left everything behind to start from nothing, and she was still afraid every day because she knew he was still out there somewhere, searching for her. "I want to know if Ryan Mitchell gets anywhere near Savannah," Anthony said, his voice cold as steel. "Put people on it. And I want someone keeping an eye on the Oakwood Apartments area, quietly. Don't let her know." Frank stood, then paused at the door. "Boss," he said carefully, "I've worked for you 15 years. I've never asked why you did anything, but this time I need to know. Who is she to you?" Anthony didn't turn around. He remained there, staring out the window at the world he had ruled through fear and violence for nearly 20 years. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "I don't know yet." The door closed behind Frank, and Anthony stayed where he was, the file on Sarah Mitchell lying on his desk, and in his chest a decision had already taken shape that he couldn't yet explain to himself. 2 weeks after his birthday night, Anthony's phone vibrated at 9 in the evening while he was sitting alone in his study. pretending to read financial reports he wasn't really absorbing. An unfamiliar number glowed on the screen, yet he knew instantly who it was before he even lifted the phone. He knew because he had been waiting for this call, even if he would never admit that to anyone, not even himself. "Hello," he said calmly. The other end stayed silent for a moment. Then Sarah's voice came through, soft and slightly unsteady, as though she had had to climb over a wall of hesitation before pressing his number. "It's Sarah," she said, "from the restaurant. I don't know if you remember." "I do," Anthony replied, and he heard the quiet release of her breath through the line. She was silent again for several seconds, and he didn't interrupt. He knew she needed time to say what she had to say. "I'm sorry for calling," Sarah finally said, her words speeding up as though she were afraid she would lose her nerve if she didn't rush. "I shouldn't have called. I know you were just being polite when you gave me your number. I don't know who else to call. And my car, the mechanic says it needs both a new battery and a starter. Almost $2,000 altogether. And I don't have it. Not yet. I will, but I have to wait until the end of next month when I get paid. But I need the car to get to work, and if I don't get to work, I don't have money to fix the car, and..." She stopped, breathing hard. "I'm sorry. I didn't call to ask for money. I don't know why I called. I'm going to hang up." "Don't hang up," Anthony said, and he could hear her freeze on the other end. "Where are you?" "At home. Chloe's asleep." Anthony glanced at the clock. "Where's your car?" "Still in the restaurant parking lot. They didn't tow it because I begged them. But they said if it isn't moved this weekend, they'll call a towing company." Anthony nodded even though she couldn't see him. "I know a guy," he said. "Marcus. He runs a repair shop on Liberty Street. He owes me a few favors. I'll call him and he'll fix your car. You pay when you can. No interest. No deadline." Sarah was silent for so long. Anthony thought she had hung up. "Why are you doing this?" she asked at last, her voice edged with the kind of suspicion he understood very well. "What do you want from me?" Anthony considered the question. He thought about the file in his desk drawer, about the hospital reports, about Ryan Mitchell somewhere out there. He thought about a man who had broken her ribs, beaten her until she ran across state lines, and how she still assumed every man wanted something from her. "I don't want anything," he said. "I just know a good mechanic. You don't owe me a thing. You owe him for the repairs when you can pay." That's it. He gave her Marcus's address and told her to go there in the morning. The car would be towed overnight. She didn't ask how he could arrange everything so quickly at 9 in the evening, and he didn't explain. "Thank you," she said before hanging up, the words leaving her as though they hurt. Anthony knew how hard it was for her to say thank you, and that made him respect her more. 3 days later, he received a text from her. "The car's fixed. Marcus didn't take any money up front." "I don't know how to thank you." Anthony stared at the message for a long time before replying. "No need to thank me. How's Chloe doing?" The answer came 5 minutes later. "Chloe's fine. She asked about the giant man." Anthony found himself smiling. A small smile he couldn't stop. "Tell her I'm not a giant. Just tall. She doesn't believe me. She says you drive a rich giant's car." And just like that, the messages began. Not every day, not often, but enough for Anthony to realize he had started checking his phone every morning and every night. Sarah told him little things, about Chloe begging for a cat, about rude customers at the grocery store, about how she was trying to learn to cook something new and burned the pot 2 nights in a row. Anthony didn't talk about his own life. He couldn't, but he asked about her, about Chloe, about the ordinary details he had forgotten even existed. Then one day she texted to ask if he wanted to have lunch, as a way of thanking him for helping her. He knew he should refuse. He knew that every time he saw her, he was pulling her and Chloe closer to his world, a world they had no business touching. But he typed okay before his brain could stop his fingers. They met at a small diner near the grocery store where she worked, a modest place with formica tables and printed menus taped to the wall. Chloe ran over and wrapped her arms around his leg the second she saw him walk in, and Anthony stood there, not knowing what to do with the 2 small arms clinging to him. "Giant man," Chloe looked up at him with a beaming grin. "I missed you." Anthony looked down at the child, then up at Sarah standing by the table, worry flickering in her eyes as though she wasn't sure how he would react. And in that moment, Anthony Caruso, the Mafia boss of Savannah, the man who had made an entire city tremble, realized he had stepped into something he didn't know how to step away from. A month passed faster than Anthony had expected. Lunches became routine, 2 or 3 times a week, Always in simple places Sarah chose because she wasn't comfortable with him paying for expensive meals. They met at the sandwich shop near the grocery store, at the little ice cream parlor Chloe adored, at Forsyth Park on weekend afternoons when Chloe ran across the grass and the two adults sat on a stone bench watching her. Anthony couldn't remember the last time he had sat on a park bench, maybe when he was a boy and his father was still alive, before the world had turned into closed-door meetings and decisions he couldn't take back. Chloe started calling him Tony, instead of the giant man, and she no longer looked at him like some strange creature, but like a fixed part of her small life. She told him about kindergarten, about a girl named Lily who had lost her front tooth, about the stray cat she was trying to tame by leaving leftovers on the stairwell. Anthony listened to everything, and he was startled to realize he genuinely cared about the trivial stories of a 5-year-old. Sarah was more cautious. She didn't say much about herself, at least not the important things. But Anthony was patient. He had spent his whole life reading people, hunting for their weaknesses and secrets. Yet with her he didn't rush. He waited, and little by little she began to open up. The first time was one afternoon at the park when Chloe was on the swings several dozen yards away and couldn't hear the adults' conversation. Sarah was wearing long sleeves, even though the weather was warm, and when she reached for her water bottle, her cuff slid down, revealing a long white scar running along her wrist. She pulled the sleeve back at once, but she knew he had seen it. "It isn't what you think," she said quickly, her tone defensive in a way he had come to recognize. "I didn't do that to myself." Anthony said nothing. He waited. Sarah glanced at Chloe, laughing on the swing set, and when she spoke again, her voice was so low he had to lean closer to hear. "My ex-husband, she stopped, swallowing. "He used a knife once when I tried to run. He said if I ran, he'd do the same thing to Chloe." Anthony felt his body go rigid. His hand clenched into a fist on his thigh, and he forced his face to stay still, to hide the rage boiling inside him. He had read the file. He had known about the hospital visits, about the restraining order, about all of it. But hearing her say it, hearing the tremor in her voice, was something else entirely. "What's his name?" he asked, his voice frighteningly calm. Sarah looked at him, and something flickered in her eyes, surprised that he wasn't reacting with pity or revulsion, or any of the things she was used to seeing. "Ryan," she said. "Ryan Mitchell." He didn't ask for more. He didn't tell her to go into detail. He only nodded and said, "You're safe now. He doesn't know you're here." Sarah laughed, a bitter sound. "You don't know him. He'll find me. He always does. I ran twice before I came here. Both times he found me. This time I was more careful, but I know it's only a matter of time." In the weeks that followed, Sarah told the rest of the story in fragments, as though she were unloading the weight piece by piece because she was afraid that if she dropped it all at once it would crush her. She told him about the night he was drunk and shoved her down the stairs when she was 7 months pregnant with Chloe. She told him about the time he locked her in a closet for 2 days because she spoke to a male cashier at the supermarket. She told him about the scar on her back she would never show him, the mark from the time he stubbed a cigarette out on her skin. And Anthony listened to every word. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge, didn't offer hollow advice. He simply sat there and listened, and each story she told was another log thrown onto the fire burning in his chest. One night after dropping Sarah and Chloe off, Anthony called Frank. "Double the surveillance around Oakwood," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. 24/7, and I want daily updates on anyone who comes near her apartment. "Understood," Frank replied. "Anything else?" Anthony thought of Ryan Mitchell, of the man's face in the photograph, of what he had done to the woman Anthony couldn't stop thinking about. "If Ryan Mitchell shows up within 100 miles of Savannah," he said, "I want to know before he even gets out of his car." Frank was silent for a moment. "And when you know, then what?" Anthony didn't answer. He didn't need to. Frank had worked for him long enough to know the answer without hearing it spoken aloud. It happened on a Saturday afternoon, 2 months after the birthday dinner at Gregory's. Chloe had forgotten her favorite teddy bear in Anthony's car after a trip to the park, and she cried all night because she couldn't sleep without it. Sarah texted Anthony, and he told her to come pick it up because he was busy at home and couldn't go out. He sent the address without thinking. Or maybe some part of him wanted her to see, wanted her to know before things went too far, even if he wouldn't admit that to himself. Sarah drove the repaired Honda Civic through Savannah's streets, from the crumbling Oakwood neighborhood she lived in, to Ardsley Park, where stately old mansions sat behind iron gates and perfectly trimmed green lawns. When she stopped in front of the address Anthony had sent, she thought she must have made a mistake. The mansion before her was a massive colonial revival structure, with towering white columns and ornate wrought iron balconies, the kind of house she only saw in movies or in magazines she never bought. But what made her freeze wasn't the luxury of the place. It was the two men in black suits standing at the gate, communication devices tucked into their ears, eyes sweeping over her car with the alertness of men trained to spot threats. And when the gate opened for her to drive inside, she saw 3 more glossy black vehicles parked in the courtyard. Saw more men with rigid postures and sharp gazes, and she noticed one of them had a gun visible beneath his jacket when he bent to murmur into a radio. Sarah's heart began to race. Every survival instinct that had kept her alive through years with Ryan was screaming in her head, telling her to turn the car around, to run, to accept that she'd made a terrible mistake trusting a man she didn't truly know. But she didn't run. She parked, stepped out, and walked into the house when an older man with salt and pepper hair opened the door for her. Anthony was standing in the living room beside a marble fireplace, and when he saw her, his face became unreadable in a way she hadn't seen before. The teddy bear lay on a burgundy leather sofa, but Sarah didn't look at it. She only looked at Anthony, at the house, at everything she had deliberately not looked at for 2 months. The Maserati, the way he paid for everything in cash, the way people seemed to know him and fear him wherever they went, the way he could arrange things with a single phone call no matter the hour. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaking, not from fear but from anger at herself for not asking sooner. "Who are you really?" Anthony didn't answer right away. He studied her for a long moment, and she could see a battle playing out behind his cool gray eyes. Then he said, his tone as calm as if he were reciting the weather, "My full name is Anthony Michael Caruso. My family has run Savannah since before I was born, and I've been the head of that family since I was 18. Sarah knew what that meant. She didn't live in a bubble. She'd seen movies, read newspapers, heard stories about families like that. "Mafia," she said, the word leaving her mouth like an accusation. "You're Mafia." Anthony didn't deny it. He didn't explain. He didn't apologize. He simply stood there and looked at her, waiting for her reaction as though he'd been expecting this moment for a long time. Sarah felt as though the ground beneath her feet was giving way. She thought about the lunches, the afternoons at the park, the way Chloe wrapped her arms around his leg and called him Tony. She thought about how she'd let a crime boss step into her daughter's life without knowing it. "I ran from a monster," she said, her voice breaking, "only to lead my daughter to another one." Anthony flinched slightly as if her words had struck him, but he didn't argue. "You have every right to think that," he said. "I would never hurt you or Chloe, but I understand if you don't believe me." Sarah stepped back, then another step, her eyes never leaving him as though she feared that if she turned away, he'd become something even more dangerous than what she'd already seen. She grabbed the teddy bear from the sofa and clutched it to her chest like a shield. "Don't contact me again," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "Don't come near me or my daughter." She didn't wait for him to answer. She turned and walked out of the house, past the men in black suits, past the gleaming black cars, and she drove away without looking back. Only when she was several miles from the Caruso estate did she pull over to the side of the road and let the tears fall, unsure whether she was crying from anger, from fear, or because she had just lost something she hadn't realized she had begun to cherish. On the other side of the city, inside a warehouse converted into offices in the industrial district along the Savannah River, Tommy Ricci sat behind an oak desk and stared at the photographs spread before him with the smile of a man who had just struck gold. Tommy was 52 years old, short and thick-set with thinning hair and narrow eyes that always seemed to be squinting as though he were calculating something. The Ricci family had fought over territory with the Carusos for 3 decades, and through all 3 of those decades they had always been the losing side. Tommy's father had died at the hands of Anthony's father. Tommy's brother had vanished without a trace after trying to seize part of Caruso territory 10 years earlier. And Tommy himself had spent his life in Anthony Caruso's shadow, forced to bow his head and accept the crumbs the younger boss tossed his way. But now, for the first time in many years, Tommy saw an opening. The photos in front of him showed Anthony Caruso sitting on a park bench with a brown-haired woman and a little girl. Anthony Caruso eating ice cream with them like an ordinary father. Anthony Caruso smiling. A real smile that Tommy had never once seen on that icy face. "Who is she?" Tommy asked the man standing across from him. "A fixer named Vinny, who specialized in tailing people and gathering information." "Sarah Mitchell," Vinny replied. 27 years old, single mother, works as a cashier at a grocery store and waits tables at a bar. Lives at Oakwood Apartments, Moved to Savannah 6 months ago from Atlanta. No ties to our world. Tommy picked up one photograph, the one showing Anthony lifting the little girl so she could reach a high tree branch in the park. The ruthless boss of Savannah holding a child and looking like a fool in love. What's special about her? Tommy asked. Nothing, Vinny shrugged. Just a regular woman with a kid and a pile of debt. But there is something interesting. She's hiding from her ex-husband, a guy named Ryan Mitchell, prior domestic violence charges, currently wanted for violating a restraining order. Tommy straightened, his narrow eyes lighting up. Find him, he ordered. Bring him to me. 3 days later, Ryan Mitchell sat in a dark basement room of the warehouse, his wrists cuffed to a chair, his face pale and his eyes wild with the look of an addict in withdrawal. He had been found in a cheap motel outside Macon, drowning in drink and despair. And when Tommy's men offered him a deal, he hadn't needed long to think about it. I'll tell you where your wife is, Tommy said, his voice sweet with poisonous honey. And I'll give you $10,000 to do whatever you want to her. Ryan stared at Tommy with sunken eyes, and a twisted smile crept across his lips. She's mine, he said, his voice shaking with hatred. She took my daughter and ran. She thinks she can leave me. Nobody leaves me. Tommy slid a sheet of paper across the table with the address of Oakwood Apartments and Sarah's work schedule from both jobs printed on it. Ryan looked at the page like a treasure map, and Tommy knew he had found the perfect knife to drive into Anthony Caruso's heart. Break the thing your enemy loves most, and you break the enemy himself. Tommy had learned that lesson from his father, and now he intended to use it. He didn't need to touch Anthony Caruso with his own hands. He only had to unleash a mad monster into the life of the woman that boss was protecting, and sit back to watch everything fall apart. That night came on a Wednesday, 3 days after Sarah had walked out of the Caruso estate. 3 days in which she tried to forget everything that had happened and focus on her ordinary life. She went to work, she picked Chloe up from Mrs. Thompson's apartment, she cooked dinner, she read her daughter a bedtime story, and she tried not to think about Anthony, about the way he had looked at her when she left, about the silence of her phone that she was both grateful for and hollowed out by. She didn't know that Anthony's men had been pulled back the night she asked him not to contact her, because Anthony respected her wishes even though it went against every instinct he had. She didn't know that the decision had left a gap in the defenses, a gap Ryan Mitchell would slip through at 2 in the morning. Sarah was asleep when she heard the pounding at the door, not knocking but fists and kicks, the sound of someone trying to break in. Her heart stalled for a beat and then hammered wildly when she recognized it, the sound she had heard in nightmares for 4 years. She leapt from bed, ran to Chloe's room, and shook her daughter awake in the dark. "Chloe, wake up," she whispered, her voice trembling even as she forced it to stay steady so she wouldn't frighten her more. "Get into the closet right now. Don't come out no matter what happens. Don't come out until Mom or the police come for you." "Mommy," Chloe whispered back, her wide eyes shining in the dark, flooded with fear. "What's happening?" "A bad man is here," Sarah said, and she tried to smile even though her lips were shaking. "But you'll be safe if you stay in the closet. Do you remember anyone's phone number?" Chloe nodded, and in that instant Sarah was grateful that her daughter had an uncanny memory for numbers. "I remember Tony's number," Chloe whispered. Sarah wanted to tell her to call the police instead of Anthony, but the crash of the door giving way sounded, and she had no time left. She shoved the phone into Chloe's hand, pushed her into the closet, and shut the door just as heavy footsteps thundered into the apartment. Sarah turned to face her nightmare. Ryan stood in Chloe's bedroom doorway, his body casting a dark shadow under the hallway light, the stench of alcohol and sour sweat rolling off him. He was thinner than she remembered, his cheeks hollow and his eyes sunken with dark circles beneath them, the marks of years of addiction and drifting. But what stole her breath wasn't his appearance, it was the gun in his hand, the barrel pointed straight at her. "You think you can run from me," Ryan slurred, drunk yet seething with hate. "You took my daughter. You left me. Who do you think you are?" Sarah raised her hands, forcing her voice to stay calm even though her heart was pounding as if it would explode. "Ryan, calm down. We can talk." "Talk," Ryan laughed, a crazed sound with no humor in it. "You want to talk now? Now you want to talk?" He advanced and Sarah backed away, but the small room gave her nowhere to go. He grabbed her hair and yanked her down, dragging her across the floor, and Sarah felt the familiar pain she had tried to forget, the pain of being hauled like an animal. "Where's the kid?" Ryan roared, his eyes sweeping the room. "Where is she?" "Chloe isn't here," Sarah lied, her voice breaking as Ryan pulled harder on her hair. "She's at a friend's place." Ryan hit her, the first blow landing on her temple and sending stars exploding across her vision, the second smashing her lip and flooding her mouth with the metallic taste she knew too well. "Don't lie to me," he screamed. "I know she's here. They told me she's here." Inside the closet, Chloe clutched the phone with shaking hands, tears sliding down her cheeks in silence. She heard her mother screaming, heard the blows, heard the man shouting words she didn't understand. She wanted to run out, wanted to save her mother, but her mother had told her to stay, and Chloe was a good child. She always listened to her mom. With trembling fingers, Chloe unlocked the phone and dialed the only number she remembered, the one she had memorized without realizing it because she liked numbers and because she liked Tony. The line rang once, twice, and then a familiar voice answered. "Hello, Tony," Chloe whispered, her voice thick as she fought not to cry out loud. "A bad man is hurting, Mom. I'm scared." On the other end of the line, Anthony Caruso sprang to his feet in his study, and in that instant his world collapsed and ignited at the same time. Anthony didn't remember how he ran out of his study, didn't remember shouting orders for Frank to gather men, didn't remember diving into his Maserati and flooring the accelerator. All he knew was that Chloe's trembling voice was still ringing in his ears, her muffled crying, the words "I'm scared," and a fury he had never felt in his life was burning everything inside him to ash. He drove through Savannah at a speed that turned streetlights into blurred streaks, one hand gripping the wheel, the other still holding the phone to his ear. "Where are you, Chloe?" he asked, his voice terrifyingly calm, even though his heart was pounding as if it would burst out of his chest. "In the closet," Chloe whispered. "Mom told me to stay here, but I hear Mom crying." "Tony, my mom never cries." "You're doing great," Anthony said, and he didn't know how he was managing to keep his voice steady when his whole world was collapsing. "Stay in the closet and don't come out. Tony's coming right now. Tony's going to protect your mom. Promise, Tony, you won't come out, okay?" "I promise," Chloe whispered, and Anthony heard her small sob before he ended the call so he could focus on the road. 12 minutes. That was how long it took him to get from the Caruso estate to Oakwood Apartments, a stretch that normally took at least 25 minutes. He didn't care about red lights, didn't care about speed limits, didn't care about anything except getting there as fast as possible. When he screeched to a stop in front of the crumbling building, he saw Sarah's apartment door standing wide open, light spilling into the dark hallway, and he heard a man's screams echoing down from the second floor. Anthony sprinted up the stairs 2 at a time, and when he reached the apartment doorway, the sight inside froze everything in him for a single second before it detonated. Sarah lay on the living room floor, blood running from her mouth and from a cut on her forehead, her arms shielding her face from the kicks of the man standing over her. Ryan Mitchell looked far worse than the photograph in the file, gaunt, deranged, and so drunk he hadn't even noticed someone else had entered the apartment. His gun lay on the coffee table a few steps away, and Anthony knew he had to move before Ryan remembered it. Anthony didn't say a word. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and seized Ryan by the collar from behind, yanking him off Sarah with such force that he flew backward into the wall. Ryan slammed into it with a crack, and before he could understand what was happening, Anthony's fist smashed into his face. The first punch shattered his nose, the second broke his cheekbone, the third, fourth, fifth, each blow carrying 18 years of violence Anthony had learned to control, each strike a promise that this man would never touch Sarah or Chloe again. Ryan tried to fight back, tried to reach for the gun on the table, but Anthony was faster. He kicked the weapon away and kept hitting him, not with blind rage, but with the cold precision of someone trained to inflict pain. He beat Ryan until he could no longer stand, until he was nothing more than a moaning heap on the floor, and he would have kept going if a small voice hadn't risen from the bedroom doorway. "Tony," Anthony froze, fist lifted halfway, and turned his head. Chloe stood there, clutching her teddy bear, wide eyes staring at the scene in fear and confusion. She shouldn't have left the closet. She had promised. But she was 5 years old, and she had heard her mother stop screaming, and she needed to know whether her mother was all right. Anthony lowered his fist. He looked at Ryan at his feet, the man who had broken Sarah's bones, who had made her live in terror for 4 years, who deserved to die a slow and brutal death. But Chloe was watching, and Anthony didn't want that child to see him kill. "Go to your mom," he told Chloe, his voice gentler than he thought he was capable of in that moment. "She needs you." Chloe ran to Sarah, and Sarah, despite the pain, wrapped her arms around her daughter and whispered soothing words. Anthony turned back to Ryan and pulled out his phone to call Frank. "Call the police," he said. Report a break-in and an assault at Oakwood Apartments. Send them everything on Ryan Mitchell. The warrant, his record, all of it. I want him in prison and never coming out." He ended the call and looked down at Ryan, who was groaning in his own blood. "You're lucky," Anthony said coldly. "If the kid wasn't here, you wouldn't still be breathing to go to jail." Ryan didn't answer. He didn't have the strength to answer, and when police sirens wailed in the distance, Anthony walked over to Sarah and Chloe, dropped to his knees beside them, and for the first time that night allowed himself to breathe. The police came and went, taking Ryan Mitchell away in handcuffs, along with a long list of charges that would keep him in prison for at least 15 years. Sarah was examined on site by paramedics. The cut on her forehead needed 4 stitches, and her lip was so swollen she could barely speak. But she refused to go to the hospital because she didn't want to leave Chloe, and when it was over and the apartment fell into silence with yellow tape stretched across the doorway, Anthony looked at Sarah and said, his voice allowing no argument, "You can't stay here tonight. You and Chloe are coming with me." Sarah was too exhausted to protest. She nodded, and Anthony lifted Chloe from her arms where she had already fallen asleep and carried her to the car while Sarah followed on shaking legs. They drove through the Savannah night in silence, and when they reached the Caruso estate, Sarah no longer had the strength to feel fear or anger the way she had the last time she came here. She only felt hollow, as though every emotion had been wrung out of her by the night. Rosa, Anthony's housekeeper, a 60-year-old woman with silver hair and kind eyes, met them at the door and guided Sarah toward the living room, while saying the child needed to be put to bed first. Anthony carried Chloe upstairs and settled her into a room already prepared with soft sheets and heavy curtains to block the light. The girl didn't wake as he laid her down, and he stood there for a moment studying her innocent sleeping face, thinking about how brave she had been to call him from inside that dark closet while listening to her mother being beaten without screaming. When he went back downstairs, Sarah was sitting on the living room sofa, with both hands wrapped around a mug of hot tea. Rosa had made for her, her eyes fixed on the empty space in front of her. Anthony took the chair opposite her and kept his distance because he didn't want her to feel threatened. "Are you all right?" he asked, even though he knew it was a foolish question. "I don't know," Sarah answered honestly, her voice rough from screaming and crying. "I don't know how I feel." They sat in silence for a long time, and then Sarah looked up, her eyes finding his in the dim light of the living room. "Why did you come?" she asked. "I told you not to contact me anymore. I told you to stay away, and you still came." "Because Chloe called me," Anthony said. "Didn't you call the police?" Sarah asked, and there was something in her voice that wasn't accusation but curiosity. "You could have called them and had them come. You didn't have to go yourself." Anthony thought about that, about the moment he heard Chloe's trembling voice on the phone, about how his world had narrowed to a single goal of reaching her as fast as possible. "Because I couldn't not come," he said finally, his voice lower and more honest than she had ever heard it. "Because when Chloe called, when she said she was scared, I didn't think about anything else. I didn't think about the police. I didn't think about consequences. I didn't think about anything at all. I only thought about you and Chloe." Sarah studied him, and for the first time since she had learned who he really was, she truly looked at him. Not the Mafia boss, not the dangerous man she should stay away from, but the man who had driven through the night to save her. The man who had beaten her attacker until he couldn't stand. The man who had stopped because a 5-year-old child was watching. "Tell me," she said, "about you, about all of this. I want to understand." And Anthony, a man who hadn't spoken about himself to anyone in nearly 20 years, who had learned to keep everything locked inside and never reveal weakness, realized he was talking. He told her about his father, about the man who had taught him everything he knew, about the night 18 years earlier when his father was shot dead in an ambush, and he, an 18-year-old boy, had been forced to take over an empire he didn't want and wasn't ready for. He told her about the decisions he had made, about sleepless nights, about becoming something frightening so the people he loved could be safe. He told her about the loneliness, about the vast mansion he returned to every night, about how he hadn't thought he was still capable of feeling anything until she had invited him to sit at her table on his birthday. Sarah listened, and when he finished, she didn't speak. She only stood, walked to him, and sat down beside him on the chair with her shoulder touching his. They stayed that way until dawn without another word. Yet the silence said more than anything spoken ever could. 3 months passed like a dream Anthony could hardly believe was real. Sarah and Chloe never went back to the Oakwood apartment, partly because it had become a crime scene, and partly because Anthony wouldn't allow them to return there, and Sarah, for the first time in her life, didn't object to being protected by someone. They stayed at the Caruso estate. First only temporarily, then 1 week became 2, 2 weeks became a month, and a month became something none of them named, yet all of them understood. The mansion that had once been cold and silent like a tomb was now filled with Chloe's laughter, the sound of small feet racing up the stairs, the endless questions she asked every day about everything, from why the sky was blue to why Tony owned so many cars. Rosa, who had worked for the Caruso family for 30 years and had watched Anthony grow from a cheerful boy into a ruthless boss, told Sarah she had never seen him like this, that he was becoming the man he should have been if life hadn't forced him to become something else. Anthony learned new things every day, things a mafia boss never needed to know but a man in a family did. He learned how to tie Chloe's hair, even though the first time she looked as if she had a bird nest on her head, and Sarah had to pretend to cough to hide her laughter. He learned how to read fairy tales with the right tone, even though Chloe complained that he made princesses sound like bosses giving orders to underlings. And he learned how to make pancakes in the morning, a skill he was certain he could master because he had mastered far harder things in life. He was wrong. That Sunday morning, Anthony stood in the vast kitchen wearing a blue apron Chloe had chosen, because she said it made him look less scary, staring at the smoking pan as if it were an enemy to be defeated. This was his 4th attempt. The 3 previous pancakes had ended up in the trash, burned so badly, even he had to admit they were inedible. Sarah sat at the table sipping coffee and watching him with a smile. She tried to hide behind the rim of her mug but didn't succeed very well. Chloe sat in the high chair beside her mother, with her legs swinging because they didn't reach the floor, drawing something with the set of colored pencils Anthony had bought her, the one with 120 different colors, because when she asked how many he wanted to buy, he had said all of them in the store. "Tony," Chloe called without looking up from her picture, "are pancakes supposed to be black?" "No," Anthony replied evenly. "Pancakes are golden brown." "Then why are Tony's pancakes black?" "Because Tony is learning for too long," Chloe observed, and Sarah almost sprayed coffee across the table. Anthony flipped the pancake and looked at its underside. "Burned black just like the others," he sighed, turned off the stove, and looked at Sarah with the face of a man accepting defeat. "We can order food," he suggested. "No," Sarah said as she stood and came over, gently taking the pan from his hand. "Let me show you. Lower heat, more patience. Not everything needs to be fast and forceful, you know." Anthony watched her pour the batter, adjust the flame, wait until small bubbles formed on the surface before flipping. She made it look effortless, and he realized it was the first time in his life someone had taught him something that wasn't about inflicting pain. "Dad, I want a bunny-shaped pancake," Chloe said, and the entire kitchen froze. Sarah's hand stopped mid-motion. Anthony turned to look at Chloe, and Chloe, realizing what she had just said, widened her eyes in fear and burst into tears. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, with tears streaming down her cheeks. "I didn't mean it. I know Tony isn't Dad. I'm sorry. Don't be mad at me." Anthony felt his chest tighten. He went to Chloe and knelt so their eyes were level, wiping her tears with his thumb in a tenderness he hadn't known he was capable of until he did it. "Chloe," Anthony said softly in a way Frank wouldn't have believed if he heard it. "You don't need to apologize. You didn't do anything wrong." Chloe looked at him with red, watery eyes full of doubt. "Tony isn't mad." "No, Tony doesn't want me to call him that." Anthony paused for a second, then said something he hadn't known he wanted to say until it left his mouth. "You can call Tony whatever you want, and if you want to call Tony Dad." He stopped and swallowed. "Then Tony would be very happy." Chloe stared at him for a long moment, as if testing whether he meant it. Then she threw her arms around his neck, small limbs squeezing with the surprising strength of a 5-year-old, and Anthony hugged her back, feeling his eyes burn in a way he hadn't felt in many years. Behind him, Sarah stood silent with one hand over her mouth and tears sliding down her cheeks as she watched the man she had once called a monster hold her daughter as if she were the most precious thing in the world. And maybe, to him, she truly was. Happiness never came without a price. Anthony knew that. He had lived long enough in this world to understand that everything good attracted someone who wanted to destroy it. The news arrived one afternoon while he was sitting in his office reviewing financial reports. Frank walked in with a tenser face than usual and placed 2 folders on his desk. "Bad news or very bad news first?" Frank asked. And Anthony knew immediately the day wouldn't end well. Tommy Ricci had discovered the connection between Ryan Mitchell and the plot to attack Sarah, And although Ryan was sitting in jail awaiting trial, Tommy was still searching for other ways to strike. He had begun courting several of Caruso's business partners, whispering in their ears that Anthony had grown soft, that the boss of Savannah was distracted by a woman and a child, that this was the perfect time to shift alliances. Some had listened. 2 shipping contractors at the port had switched to working with Ricci. An underground casino owner on the outskirts had stopped paying protection money. Small cracks were beginning to appear in the empire Anthony's father had built, and he had maintained for 18 years, but that wasn't the worst news. The worst news lay in the second folder, the one Frank placed on the desk as though he were handing Anthony a death sentence. The FBI had opened an official investigation into the Caruso family. They had been watching for 6 months, gathering evidence, building a case, and according to Frank's source inside the agency, they were preparing to seek search warrants within 3 to 6 months. If they found enough proof, Anthony could face 20 years to life under RICO statutes for criminal organizations. Anthony sat in silence for a long time after Frank finished. He looked out the window where he could see Chloe playing in the garden with Sarah, the little girl trying to teach her mother some game he didn't understand, but both of them were laughing. He thought about what he could lose. Not money or power or territory, but this image, this sound of laughter. If he went to prison, Chloe would grow up without him. Sarah would have to face the world alone again, and he would become exactly what he had tried not to be, an absent father, a man who existed only in memories and visits through thick glass. "Boss," Frank said cautiously, "we can handle Ricci. He isn't strong enough to challenge us directly. And about the FBI, we've got lawyers, ways to stall. We've got." Anthony raised a hand and Frank fell silent. "I want to meet our lawyers," Anthony said, his voice calm but carrying something different. A resolve Frank had never heard before. Not the criminal attorneys, corporate attorneys, and I want a full list of every asset, business, and revenue stream in the family divided into 2 columns. One column for what is completely legal, the other for what isn't. Frank stared at him, as though unsure he had heard correctly. "Boss, what are you saying?" "I'm saying I want to know how long it would take to transition entirely into legitimate businesses." Frank opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. "That," he said slowly, "would take years, maybe 5 years, maybe 10, and we'd lose a lot of money in the process. A lot of power, a lot of influence." "I know," Anthony replied. "And what about Tommy Ricci?" "About Ricci?" Anthony stood and looked out the window again, watching Sarah lift Chloe onto her shoulders so the girl could pick a flower from a high branch. "He thinks I've grown weak because I have a family. He's wrong. I haven't grown weak. I just have something to lose. And a man with something to lose is far more dangerous than a man with nothing at all. Send word to Ricci that if he keeps pushing, I'll respond. Not because I want war, but because I'll do whatever it takes to protect what's mine." Frank nodded and left, and Anthony stood alone in the office, staring down at the 2 folders on his desk. He thought of his father who had built this empire with blood and fear and died for it. He thought of the past 18 years, of everything he had done to maintain it, of the sleepless nights, and the decisions he would carry for the rest of his life. And then he thought of Chloe calling him Dad, of the way Sarah smiled at him, of the kitchen filled with the smell of burned pancakes in the morning. For the first time in 18 years, Anthony Caruso made a decision not for the empire, not for the family name, not for duty, but for himself, for the future he wanted, for the 2 girls laughing in the garden outside that he wouldn't let anything take from him. He would change, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And that, perhaps, was the greatest difference of all. 6 months passed faster than Anthony had expected. 6 months of changes he had never believed he was capable of making. Tommy Ricci fell silent after receiving Anthony's message. A message that didn't need words and required only the disappearance of 3 of Ricci's closest men in a single night. Not dead, but terrified enough to leave Savannah and never return. The FBI was still investigating, but with the help of the best legal team money could buy, and the ongoing shift toward legitimate businesses, Anthony was confident they wouldn't find enough evidence to charge him. And more importantly than anything else, Sarah and Chloe were still with him, still filling the once empty mansion with laughter and life. On a Friday night near the end of the month, Anthony took Sarah to Gregory's restaurant, the place where everything had begun 6 months earlier on the night of his 36th birthday. This time, he had a reservation, the best table in the house beside a window overlooking the square glowing with warm yellow lights. This time, he wasn't alone. Chloe stayed home with Rosa because this was a date night for the adults, a concept she had picked up somewhere and insisted her mother and dad needed like normal couples. Anthony didn't know whether they were normal, a mafia boss trying to go straight, and a single mother fleeing a violent past. But he'd stopped caring what normal meant a long time ago. They sat down, and Sarah looked around the restaurant with a nostalgic smile on her lips. "Do you remember?" she asked. "The first time you walked in here?" Anthony nodded. "I remember being turned away because I didn't have a reservation. And I remember a crazy woman inviting a strange man to sit with her and her daughter." "I wasn't crazy," Sarah laughed. "I was just tired of hearing Chloe talk about unicorns for the third time and needed an adult conversation." Anthony watched her, the candlelight illuminating her face, the faint scar on her forehead that had faded but was still there like a reminder of everything she'd survived. She had changed so much in 6 months, no longer flinching when someone walked behind her, no longer glancing toward the door whenever it opened, no longer living with the constant fear that Ryan would find her. Ryan had been sentenced to 15 years in prison 2 months earlier, and for the first time in 5 years, Sarah could breathe without feeling someone's hands around her throat. The waiter brought menus, and Anthony recognized the same young man who had served them that first night, the one who'd looked confused when a stranger sat at a table with a mother and her child. The waiter didn't seem to recognize them, or if he did, he hid it well, and Anthony wondered whether he knew how much that dinner had changed 3 lives. They ordered, and after the waiter left, Sarah looked at Anthony with more seriousness than usual. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer honestly." Anthony nodded. "Do you regret it?" Sarah asked. "Everything that happened, changing everything because of me and Chloe, giving up what you spent your whole life building." Anthony considered the question for a moment, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted to be sure he spoke exactly what he felt. He thought of the past 18 years, the empire he'd kept afloat, with blood and tears, the sleepless nights, and the decisions that had haunted him. Then he thought of the past 6 months, Chloe's laughter echoing through the mansion, Sarah's smile every morning, the feeling of being called dad by a 5-year-old girl whose eyes trusted him completely. "No," he said, his voice steady as steel. "Not for a single second. This is the only right decision I've ever made in my life. Everything else I did, every decision I made over those 18 years, I did out of duty, out of survival, because I didn't have another choice. But this," he met her eyes, "I chose this. I chose you. I chose Chloe. I chose this future. And if I had to choose again 1,000,000 times, I'd choose the same every single time." Sarah didn't speak. She simply reached across the table and took his hand, and they sat there in silence. 2 people who had found each other in circumstances neither had expected, and had decided not to let go. 1 year after the fateful birthday night at Gregory's restaurant, Anthony Caruso turned 37. And for the first time in his adult life, he wasn't alone. The Caruso mansion was filled with purple balloons because Chloe insisted purple was the color of royalty, and Dad deserved to be treated like a king on his birthday, even if just for 1 day, because on other days Dad still had to listen to her. Anthony hadn't argued with that logic because he'd learned that arguing with a 6-year-old girl was a battle he couldn't win. Rosa cooked a lavish dinner in the kitchen. Frank stood in the corner with a rare smile on his usually cold face, and Sarah was trying to light the candles on the birthday cake she and Chloe had made themselves. A cake that leaned slightly to one side with uneven frosting, but perfect in its own way. So much had changed in the past year. Ryan Mitchell was sitting in federal prison serving his 15-year sentence, and every night Sarah went to sleep without checking the locks 3 times or jerking awake from nightmares. Tommy Ricci had left Savannah entirely after realizing that Anthony Caruso having a family didn't mean Anthony Caruso had grown weak but meant he'd become more dangerous than ever. The FBI had closed its investigation 3 months earlier for lack of evidence, and the Caruso family's transition to legitimate businesses was progressing better than Anthony had expected. But the greatest change wasn't any of that. The greatest change was Anthony himself, the way he laughed more, the way he knew the names of all Chloe's classmates, the way he could make pancakes without burning them anymore, even if they still weren't perfect, the way he looked at Sarah every morning when she woke beside him and felt like the luckiest man in the world. After dinner, while Chloe was busy devouring cake and Rosa was cleaning up in the kitchen, Anthony led Sarah onto the balcony overlooking the garden lit by tiny lights Chloe had demanded he hang because they looked like fireflies. "I've got something I want to ask you," Anthony said, and Sarah noticed a slight tremor in his voice, something she'd never heard from him, even when he faced enemies or danger. He pulled out a small black velvet box and opened it. Inside lay a ring with a diamond, not overly large, but glittering beneath the lights. Sarah, Anthony said in a low, sincere voice. I'm not good at flowery words. I've spent my whole life giving orders and making threats, not talking about feelings, but I want you and Chloe to carry the Caruso name, not just because I want to marry you, even though I want that more than anything I've ever wanted in my life, but because when you carry the Caruso name, you and Chloe will be protected for life. Nobody will dare touch you. Nobody will dare hurt Chloe. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure of that. Sarah looked at the ring, then at Anthony, and in his gray eyes she saw everything he couldn't say aloud. Love, fear, hope, and a promise. She thought about 1 year earlier when she'd been nothing more than an exhausted single mother inviting a stranger to sit at her table because she needed adult conversation. She'd never imagined that small decision would lead here. To this moment. To this man kneeling before her with a ring and his heart in his hands. Yes, she said, and tears slid down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of happiness. Anthony slipped the ring onto her finger, and when he stood and pulled her into his arms, a voice rang out from the balcony doorway. Can I be the flower girl? Chloe stood there with frosting still smeared on her face, and big eyes shining with excitement. I knew it. I knew it from the start. I'm a love prophet. Sarah laughed through her tears. When did you overhear? Since Dad said he had something he wanted to ask you. I knew it was a proposal because I watch movies. Anthony looked at the girl he'd learned to love as his own. The girl who called him Dad. The girl who'd phoned him in the darkest night and believed he'd come to save her. Of course you can be the flower girl, he said. Nobody else gets that job but you. Chloe squealed and ran to hug both of them, and the three of them stood there on the balcony beneath the firefly lights and the Savannah night sky. A family formed not by blood but by choice, by love, by small decisions that led to great change. And there in the mansion that had once been cold and full of shadows, now bursting with purple balloons and laughter, the devil had found his redemption, not in heaven but at a crowded restaurant table where a tired single mother had invited him to sit down. Who would have thought a refused table could be the beginning of a family? This story reminds us that life never goes according to plan, and sometimes the best things come from moments we don't expect. It teaches us that nobody is defined by their past, that a man who once did terrible things can still choose to become better, that a woman who was once hurt can still open her heart to love again. And most of all, it reminds us that family isn't always the people who share our blood, but the people who choose to stand by us, choose to protect us, choose to love us, knowing all our flaws and our history. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like and share this video so we can bring you more meaningful stories every day. We'd love to know how you felt about it. Have you ever met someone who changed your life in a way you never expected? Do you believe everyone deserves a second chance? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one and truly want to hear the stories and feelings from deep in your heart. Thank you for staying with us until the end of the video. We wish you and your family good health and a joyful, peaceful life every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.